Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught. I'm excited to be here with you. I'm the content director here at Word on Fire. And joining us, as he does every week, is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Brandon, it's good to be with the great Brandon Vaught.
Hey, we are continuing our series today on the pivotal players. So this, of course, comes from your new film series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Players, which is just on the cusp of being released. It comes out on September 1st, so it's right around the corner here. I'd encourage anyone listening to this, if you haven't already, be sure to go to pivotalplayers.com and order your series today. Now, I'll tell you what, we have a special code for you, too, just for the listeners of this show. If you use the coupon code DUMBOX, DUMBOX, and that'll make a lot of sense here in a second once we talk about what we're going to be discussing on this episode. But if you go to pivotalplayers.com, use the code DUMBOX, you'll get $10 off of the Pivotal Players film series. So be sure to do that very, very soon. So over the next 5 episodes, we're continuing our series here, devoting one episode to each of the figures that you feature in your film series. We did an episode on St. Francis last week, and today we're going to be looking at the dumb ox, St. Thomas Aquinas. I know he's meant so much to you, but before we dig into him, I hate to postpone it. Let's get a little update on what's been going on with you. You finally had time to catch your breath after World Youth Day, after confirmation season. You've had some time there in your own pastoral region of Santa Barbara, and that's allowed you to meet with a lot of the local Catholic leaders. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been fun. Several months ago, before I started my confirmation season, I wanted to meet with all the formators of confirmation students. And the idea was simply come and help me get this homily together. What do these kids know? What should they know? What do you want me to say, et cetera? Well, the meeting went so well that we said, let's institutionalize this. Why don't we meet with all the different ministerial groups in the region? So just last week, we started with the high school principals, the principals of Catholic high schools in the region. I met just the other day with the grade school principals. We also met with 40 or so members of the Knights of Columbus. We've got, I think, 5 or 6 other meetings coming up. RCA directors, liturgy people, music people, et cetera, youth ministers. And it's just been a great exercise. They come here to my house, and I ask them 3 questions. What's going well? What's a challenge? How can I help you? And then we end up talking for about an hour and a half, typically. And it's helpful to me to find out who these people are, what they do, what's on their minds and hearts. So that's been a joy.
I mentioned that today we're going to be focusing on the great St. Thomas Aquinas. He's one of the 6 figures featured in your Pivotal Players film series, and he's someone that you're very well familiar with. He, of course, had a profound influence on your own life. In past episodes, we've discussed how he really inspired your vocation to the priesthood in some ways. Let's start off with the basics. Who was St. Thomas Aquinas?
Well, Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar who lived in the 13th century. He's born either in 1224 or 1225. He dies in 1274. So he lives to be 49 or 50 years old. A Dominican friar at the very beginning of the Dominican movement. So St. Dominic is a contemporary of St. Francis, and he founds the order very early 13th century. And Thomas is one of the earliest people to join this kind of questionable band of mendicants, that just is a fancy way of saying beggars. They were a begging order who were bringing the gospel out into the streets. There was a very staid form of religious life by Thomas's time, the Benedictine order. And in fact, Thomas's family thought he should become a Benedictine and eventually become an abbot or a powerful figure in that order. But Thomas, while he's studying at the University of Naples as a young man, is drawn to this new Dominican movement. And despite the enormous opposition of his family, he joins them and becomes one of the greatest of these early Dominican preachers, teachers, and theologians. He emerges in his own lifetime and then, of course, in the centuries following his death as perhaps the key intellectual figure within Catholicism. So he's known as the angelic doctor, some say because of the angelic quality of his character, but also the angelic quality of his mind, how an angel's mind can move so rapidly. But he's also called the Doctor Communis. It's a title I like even better. It means the common doctor. So we have a lot of doctors, doctores, this means teachers in the church, all kinds of figures. But who's the touchstone? Who's the common doctor? That's Thomas Aquinas. And, not everyone agrees with everything Thomas says, but there's still something of that, what the French call pierre de touche quality, the touchstone quality about Thomas Aquinas. So that's why he's been a pivotal player, not just for me, but really for the whole church.
I mentioned the special coupon code DUMBOX for this episode. You can use it to save $10 at pivotalplayers.com. He developed that nickname as a young man, didn't he? Where did it come from? What does it mean?
Well, once he gets past the objection of his family, he makes his way to Paris and becomes a student of Albert the Great, who was another early Dominican scholar. And together they went to Cologne to finish Thomas's studies. And while he was there, he was surrounded by a lot of other, lively students. And Thomas was even as a young man, was big and taciturn. And though he was obviously one of the greatest minds in the West, the people, his own contemporaries, thought he was dumb and had that double sense it still has for us. Dumb meaning silent, but also stupid. Poor big stupid kid, So they nicknamed him the dumb ox of Sicily because he was from southern Italy. Albert the Great, who knew much better, he knew Thomas's skills, heard that. And he reportedly said, I assure you the bellowing of that ox will one day fill the world. A pretty accurate prophecy. And they say Thomas, when he was taunted, he knew about the nickname. When he was taunted, he showed infinite patience and would actually help his fellow students with their logic exercises. But he was always known for his kind of childlike simplicity that was a beautiful compliment to his angelic mind.
You see that simplicity in one of the famous stories of the young Aquinas. His teacher was talking about God, and as he sat listening, the young Aquinas finally piped up and said, Master, but what is God? And as you say, he never stopped asking that question throughout his life. So what can Thomas teach us about the answer to that question, about who God is?
Yeah, first of all, it's a darn good question. I used to tell my students when I taught at the seminary, they're frightened. There's like a group of 60 people in the room, and I'm lecturing, and I don't want to ask some stupid question. And I used to say, and I really meant it, I'd say, there is no stupid question in theology. In fact, the simplest ones are always the best ones. I've been to 100 different, academic conferences, and people get up, graduate students, and they're showing off, and they're using million-dollar words, and they're saying basically nothing. But a question like that, quid est Deus? What is God? That's a darn good question, How does the cross of Jesus save us? What does it mean to say God became one of us? Those are good questions. And see, Thomas teaches us the beauty and legitimacy of that kind of question. Then as you say, though, Brandon, I think one of the great things that he did is that he, more than really anybody else, better than anybody else, answered that question. What is God? Because Thomas, famously said, and I've echoed him over and over again, God is not a being. See, what he was, even as a little kid, probably intuiting is that it's wrong to say, well, Master, there you are, here I am, here's the desk, there's God, there's a cloud, No, God is not an item among items. He's not one being among many. But Thomas would famously call him ipsum esse, subsistens, the subsisting act of to be itself. Does that clarify it? Well, in some ways, I hope not. It's meant in a way not to clarify it. Because if we clarify it too much, we turn God into an ordinary categorical thing. That's why Thomas will say, God is not in any genus, even the genus of being. And I would suggest to people, bring that line to your prayer. Bring that to your holy hour. Because it's deeply mysterious. God is not in any genus. So, you and I are in the genus of humanity. A keyboard in front of me is in the genus of machine or whatever. Well, wouldn't God at least be in the genus of being? I mean, you and I are beings. This is a being. Isn't God the biggest being of them all? And Thomas's very direct answer is no. He's not in the genus of being. He's not a being. He's the sheer act of to be itself, which breaks and transcends all categories. Well, when you get that, you're off to the races in some ways. When you get that, you're moving into this mysterious and alluring space of the divine mystery, right? See, if God's a thing, even the biggest thing, I can get my mind around him like a lasso. I can lasso him. That's what Moses, by the way, was trying to do in the book of Exodus. What's your name? What's your name? They're going to ask me your name. Tell me your name. What was he was twirling the lasso, trying to get it around God. Even, oh, you're bigger than I am. Oh, you're a God. But if I know your name, I get my mind around you. I am who I am, says God. In one way, just say, hey, put down that lasso, pal, But it's also, Thomas took it to mean a very technical description. I am who I am. My essence, what I am, is my existence. I am who I am. To be God is to be to be. Now, again, you got that? If you think you've got it, you don't have it. But it's teasing the mind in the direction of the true God, where I don't have any traction. What did U2 say, where the streets have no name? See, that's an old mystical trope, though, where the streets have no names. I'm in a land where I don't know where I'm going. Yeah, I got my car this morning, put my GPS on, read the street signs, and I confidently went my way. Fine. I'm dealing with this little neighborhood in Southern California, but I'm moving in the space of God. I don't have that kind of control. Ipsum esse subsistens. I am who I am. To be God is to be to be. That's what Thomas gave us.
Lest anyone think that this is just a hyper-technical, abstract discussion about the nature of God, you've pointed out that this focus, this topic of who God is, lies at the root of the surge of atheism today, because there's a lot of people who reject religion or faith on the basis of misunderstanding God. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every atheist I've ever read is laboring under the assumption that God is some big being, and God's a being within the cosmos. God is one cause among many, for which there's no evidence, etc. And they go about it, of course, in a scientific way, which is the whole problem, because the sciences are geared for this world of contingent categorical existence. You open your eyes or you open your microscope or your telescope and you do your experimentation and you come to very good and real conclusions about the world of contingent causes. But God is not in that world. And so he can't be gotten at with that tool. When the atheists say, oh, we haven't found him, no evidence for him, therefore there's no God, well, it's a complete non sequitur. You're looking for something that God is not.
In the Pivotal Players episode on Thomas Aquinas, you also spend some time on Thomas's contributions to what you call theological anthropology, or to put it more simply, our understanding of the human person in light of God. How does Thomas help us here? What light does he shed on who we are as humans?
Well, he follows the main Augustinian line, I would say. Augustine, our hearts are restless, so they rest in thee. Well, Thomas would see the imago Dei, right, the image of God in us, as a kind of hunger or a trajectory. So think of the way the soul, if I can speak broadly, seeks the intelligible, right? It seeks to know. So you and I, in ordinary ways, what is that? We seek to know, to understand. How's this connected to that? Where'd that come from? What caused that? So whether you're a scientist, you're a philosopher, you're a mechanic, you're a person of common sense, you're trying to make a car work, in my case, trying to get my iPhone to work, well, we're always seeking the intelligible, right? Now, go all the way. Don't give up. Don't give up. Go all the way in seeking the intelligible. What will you come to? You'll come finally to the perfectly intelligible. You'll come to the sheer act of to be itself, that which alone can satisfy the deepest hunger of the mind for intelligibility. That's God. The will seeks the good, right? And we do it all the time. Right now, we're seeking the good of doing this program. I'll seek the good of eating lunch in about 45 minutes. I'll seek the good of I have another interview later today. Fine. The will seeks the good. Is it satisfied? Well, of course not. Of course not. It restlessly moves on. Higher goods, more important goods. Is it satisfied by anything in this world? No. It's only when it comes in the presence of the unconditioned good. Thomas's point is the imago Dei in us is a hunger, it's a longing that only God can fill. And see, I think, Brandon, with our atheist friends and agnostic friends, this truth has got to be stated over and over again. People give up way too soon. They give up way too early. I'll say, no, I'm here not to suppress your desires. I'm here to awaken your desires. You know what I'm saying? I think, the playboys of the world and all that, they're trying to suppress your desires. They're trying to say, that's all you need, man. That's all you need to be happy, to have the intelligible, to have the good. I'm here to say, no. We're just getting started. We're just getting started as I come to know truths in the world. I achieve goods within the world. I want to order you toward the infinite, the unconditioned, the unlimited, true, good, and beautiful. That's God. And see, Thomas knew that, which is why the Summa is structured in that what they call the exitus reditus pattern. Exitus, going out from, the world comes out from God, God makes the world. But then that great and mysterious reditus, which is the return to God. Think of, see, the medievals thought this way. Moderns tend not to, but the whole of created reality, longing, it's seeking. And I think, see, we're rediscovering it. Talk to the scientists today, that even at these, sub-molecular levels and so on, there's a kind of, there's a yearning, there's a longing as things are heading towards something. All of the created universe, Thomas would say, is seeking to return to the supreme good of God. We're those creatures who know it. We're in this exalted way in the image and likeness of God. That's the theological anthropology I want all the atheists and agnostics to acknowledge.
We've talked about Thomas's influence on theology, on anthropology. Let's look at his influence on the spiritual life. You like to describe Thomas Aquinas as a spiritual master. In fact, that's the subtitle of the book that you wrote on Aquinas. And we often forget that he wasn't just a gifted theologian, he was also a saint. So talk about this dimension of Thomas's life.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, everyone that knew him, and we have the records of his canonization proceedings in the early 14th century, people that still remembered him, including Bernardo Gui. He's featured in The Name of the Rose, but in a very kind of distorted way. But and also Reginald Paperno, Thomas's secretary, was there to testify. And they all talk about that. Everyone talks about the simplicity, childlike quality of Thomas's character. There was a kind of charming naivete about him, despite this massive intellect, maybe because of it. So from the earliest days, people have testified to that. But what I see, too, that any objective observer, even today, can see, is in his writings. So Thomas is never interested simply in clarifying the mind, but he wants all of us to come into living contact with Christ. Keep in mind, he was a Dominican, which means a member of the order of preachers. When he became professor at Paris, his first responsibility was predicatio, preaching. From preaching comes a second responsibility, which is Bible commentary. So he's called a magister sacrae paginae, which means a master of the holy page, right? Now, from that comes what we call theology, because anomalies arise and questions arise and interpretive dilemmas arise. And so out of biblical commentary comes what we call theology. And then out of that theology comes the text that we know, the Summa theologiae, right? The summary of theology. My point, though, is that his first task, what informed everything else, was preaching. Preaching. He was there to guide souls to Christ. I think once you crack that code, then you see it everywhere in his writings. He's trying to lure, first of all, young Dominicans to Christ, and then through them, the rest of the world.
Were there any particularly striking or poignant moments during the filming of the Aquinas episode?
For me, it was the filming we did at Fossa Nova, which is where Thomas died. So it was, at the time, a Cistercian monastery. Thomas is quite sick. He might have had a stroke. Depends on how you read the evidence, but at the age of 49, he has this extraordinary experience that was part mystical, maybe part physical, but he stopped writing. He was stupefactus, his sister famously said. So stupefied, out of his mind. What does that mean? Stupefactus. We're not quite sure what she meant. But on his way to the Council of Lyon, in that state, Thomas is taken to this abbey of Fossa Nova. He said, I don't want to die in a secular house. They'd first taken him to a castle. He said, no, take me to a religious house. And the closest one was Fossa Nova. Well, honest to God, it's a beautiful church. It's very simple and spare, kind of Romanesque moving into Gothic kind of architecture. And that's where they brought Thomas. And they have the room where he died. And we went there and prayed, and we saw the spot in the wall in the church where his bones were kept for a while. They buried his bones there because people were so eager to get his relics. They were trying to protect them. Anyway, I just found it extremely moving to be there in that place. And we have some beautiful film you'll see in the series from that very evocative church.
One thing I like about this new Pivotal Players film series is the interconnections between each of these pivotal players. Several of them have influenced several others. For instance, you have Newman, the great convert, influencing the conversion of G.K. Chesterton. And then, of course, you have G.K. Chesterton writing biographies on both St. Francis and St. Thomas Aquinas. Talk about Chesterton's biography of Thomas Aquinas and maybe the similarities between these two figures.
Yeah, I love that too, and I wanted that to come through in the series. There's something, I don't know what, mutually attractive even across the ages among these players, And yes, when I was a young man, I read Chesterton's book on Thomas, which is, famously Etienne Gilson, one of the greatest Thomist scholars of the 20th century, said, hey, I've spent my whole life studying Aquinas, and it took this journalist from England, who was by no means a scholar of Aquinas, but yet Gilson himself said it's the best book on Aquinas you can read. I read that as a young man, and it had a big impact on my own approach to him. And I'll tell you what it was precisely. It was Chesterton's insistence that Thomas is best characterized as Thomas of the Creator. Thomas of the Creator, that somehow creation is key to understanding Aquinas. I think it's dead right. And when I was a doctoral student in Paris, and one reason I went to Paris was that was Thomas Aquinas' town. That's where I wanted to study there. And I remember writing my paper in these cold winter days in Paris, and I would think, not far, it was maybe a 10-minute walk from where I lived, was where the convent of Saint-Jacques stood, where Thomas, I thought on equally cold, Paris days, was writing his own book. But anyway, when I was a doctoral student, it was Cardinal Ratzinger, who was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time. And he said, I read this, he said, I wish more younger scholars would look into the issue of creation because we've had such a stress on anthropology. And he's right, the 20th century was in many ways the century of Christian anthropology. Well, when I read that, I thought immediately, oh, that's what Chesterton said about Aquinas, that he was Thomas of the Creator. And so that little connection lit a fire in my mind and led me to do my doctoral work on Thomas's doctrine of creation in the disputed question De Potentia. Anyway, so that was a way that Chesterton spoke to me about this figure from many centuries before.
So if you're listening to this, I encourage you, watch the G.K. Chesterton episode from Pivotal Players, then watch the Thomas Aquinas episode, then go pick up Chesterton's book on Thomas Aquinas, and you'll get a wonderfully complete picture of both men. It's time now for our weekly question from one of our listeners. Every week we take a question from listeners like you. And for the next several weeks here, we're going to try to take questions related to the Pivotal Players. So if you have a question relating to any of the Pivotal Players, be sure to visit askbishopbarron.com, record your question, and each episode will pick one question to air. I'm also hoping that in the future we'll do a Q&A roundup as we've done in the past a couple times before, but this time only devoted to questions about the Pivotal Players. Today we hear from Joe from Minnesota, and he asked a question about Aquinas' famous arguments for God. So here's Joe.
Hi, Father Barron. My name is Joe DeMeyer. I'm from Hutchinson, Minnesota. I do love our Catholic faith and the depth of it. Thank you for all you do. I really enjoy Aquinas' 5 ways. One question I have for you is, how can God be the unmoved mover? How can he change things and not be changed? I do believe in the argument, but it's just one thing in particular, the conclusion, if you can clarify for me. Thank you very much. God bless.
Good. Thank you for that question. In some ways, the conclusion of that proof is to a cause that is itself not caused, or an actualizer that is not itself actualized. So in some ways, you have to come to the conclusion that the first element in this causal series is not dependent upon anything else within the causal chain. Now, part of the problem is, I think, we tend to imagine this naturally enough within the framework of our ordinary experience. And ordinary contingent things, contingent causes, tend to have that kind of mutuality about them. So Brandon was mentioning this, that if I push against you, almost ipso facto, you're pushing against me. In the very act of moving you, I'm going to be affected by it. Well, that's true of finite contingent things. But the conclusion of this argument is not to one more finite cause. Remember, I made that point earlier. It's rather to the unactualizable, actualizing energy. And so, by definition, that power, which stands outside the nexus of ordinary conditioned things, is not itself affected by or influenced by the world. Now, to make a technical point here, and it's very controversial, no one likes the way Thomas puts this, but it's making the point. He says, the world is really related to God, but God is not really related to the world. Now, right away, it doesn't mean that God is indifferent, doesn't care about the world. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is what I was just trying to say. The world depends upon God, but God does not depend upon the world. See? So in that way, he's not really related to the world. In fact, I would press the argument. It's precisely because he's not really related to the world that he can love the world so thoroughly. See, otherwise, he'll stand in some kind of need vis-a-vis the world, if that makes sense. But you're on a key point there. Take a look at his stuff on that issue of the real relation between God and the world.
I'd encourage you, Joe, to also pick up Bishop Barron's own book on Thomas Aquinas. He has a lengthy chapter in there on the arguments for God, as well as the work of Dr. Edward Fazer. He has a wonderful introduction to the metaphysical background you need to understand those arguments. Well, thanks again for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. I want to mention one more time the special coupon code that's only for you. It's only for listeners to this show. It's DUMBOX, so DUMBOX. When you use that code at pivotalplayers.com on the Pivotal Players film, you'll get $10 off. But the code is only good for the next couple weeks, so you want to make sure to do it as quick as you can. Also, the Pivotal Players film series is accompanied by several other resources. There's a wonderful study program which features writings by some of the best experts from around the world on each of these Pivotal Players. For example, on the episode on Thomas Aquinas, there's a study guide written by Dr. Matthew Levering, who's one of the great Thomistic writers of today. So be sure to check that out in addition to the films. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show as we look at another pivotal player. We'll be looking at St. Catherine of Siena. So we'll see you next week right here on the show.